"You are nothing," he said, his words cutting through the air like a blade. The ballroom stilled. Every eye turned to the man who held the power of an empire, the Duke, Sebastian Hawke. His words were cold, deliberate, and final. Eleanor Bradford stood at the farthest edge of the grand hall, her eyes fixed on the polished marble floor, barely noticeable among the dozens of aristocrats. The laughter, the clinking of crystal glasses, the soft rustling of silk, all of it faded into the background as if the world had shifted and was no longer hers. She felt the sting of every gaze, the weight of every whispered judgment. Her sister, Margaret, stood in the center, radiant and perfect, the very image of nobility, the kind of woman everyone admired, everyone desired. Eleanor's heart ached, but she knew better than to show it. She had learned long ago that her place was not here, not among the beauties and the elite. She had no title, no fortune, only her dignity left, and that was slipping away as she stood there, invisible, forgotten. The Duke moved through the crowd like a force of nature, his every step sending ripples of tension through the room. He was a man whose presence demanded respect, whose gaze could freeze the room in an instant. As he passed by the women, his eyes lingered on none of them. One by one, he dismissed the ladies as if they were mere decorations, his mind made up without a second glance. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut through. Eleanor's pulse quickened, but she stayed rooted to her spot, unwilling to move, unwilling to give in to the desire that burned within her to escape the suffocating crowd. And then, without warning, his eyes locked onto hers. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into eternity. Her breath caught in her throat as the Duke's gaze pierced her like an arrow. Her heart slammed against her chest, and in that instant, everything changed. The noise of the ballroom disappeared, leaving only the beat of her heart, the quiet whisper of her breath. She could feel the eyes of everyone around her, but none of it mattered. All that mattered was the Duke, standing there, his cold eyes fixed upon her, as if he had found something in her that none of the others had. The world around her stilled, frozen in place. His gaze did not waver. "Bring her to me," he said, his voice low, commanding. His words shattered the silence, sending a ripple of disbelief through the crowd. Eleanor felt her body move, not of her own accord, but as though his will had taken control of her limbs. She took a step forward, her shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. Every eye in the room was upon her now, every whisper, every silent judgment now aimed directly at her. Margaret's face drained of color as she turned to her sister, her lips parted in shock. Eleanor felt the weight of the world upon her shoulders, the scorn of everyone in the room pressing down on her. But none of it mattered. All that mattered was the Duke, standing in the center of the room, waiting for her. Her legs trembled beneath her, but she took another step, and then another, moving toward him as if drawn by an invisible force. Her breath was shallow, her chest tight. This was not supposed to be her life. She was not supposed to be here. She was supposed to be forgotten. But the Duke saw her. His gaze was unwavering, his intent clear. Every eye was upon her now, and she felt herself being pulled into a new reality, one where she was no longer invisible, no longer dismissed. The ballroom seemed to narrow, the grand space closing in around her. She could feel every heartbeat, every pulse of blood in her veins as she approached him. The air was thick with tension, with anticipation. Eleanor's body moved on its own, her hands trembling at her sides, her heart racing. As she drew closer, the Duke took a single step forward, extending his hand to her. There was no fanfare, no grand gesture, just the simple, inevitable movement of a man who had made his choice. The moment felt like an eternity, a single heartbeat stretched into infinity. The room held its breath as Eleanor reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the Duke's, and in that moment, everything she had ever known began to shift. The Duke's hand was still extended, his fingers barely brushing against Eleanor's as she hesitated for a heartbeat. The ballroom had fallen silent, but the weight of every eye in the room pressed down on her. Her breath caught in her throat. The air felt thick, charged with an electricity she couldn't explain. She had been seen. The Duke had chosen her. But the weight of the moment, of the decision that hung in the balance, almost overwhelmed her. Her pulse raced, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the sound of her own breath, shallow and quick, but everything else was muffled, as if the world around her had become distant, insignificant. Eleanor slowly, deliberately, reached out, her hand trembling as it met his. A chill ran through her as his fingers closed around hers, strong and steady. For a moment, they stood there, locked in an unspoken connection, the power dynamic between them shifting with each passing second. The room held its breath. Duke Sebastian's grip tightened slightly, but it was not a commanding force. There was something more in it, something that spoke of recognition, of acknowledgement. His eyes, cold and calculating just moments ago, softened ever so slightly. But Eleanor was still a stranger to him, still the woman the world had forgotten. "Walk with me," he said, his voice low, almost imperceptible, yet it rang through the space like a command. She nodded, unable to find her voice. Her steps felt heavy, as if she were walking through thick fog, unsure of what awaited her, but knowing she couldn't turn back. Every part of her screamed to flee, to run from the unfamiliar power that radiated from him. But the Duke's presence anchored her, pulling her forward, guiding her through the sea of aristocrats who parted in their wake, their gazes fixed, their whispers hushed. As they moved through the ballroom, the tension between them grew, thickening with each step. Eleanor's heart still beat erratically, but now it was a steady rhythm, one that seemed to match the Duke's own silent strength. He was a man who could command armies, who could break kingdoms with a word. But for now, it was her he wanted, her he had chosen. The whispers grew louder behind them, but Eleanor dared not look back. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room. Their judgment, their confusion, and yet there was no escaping the path the Duke had set her on. When they reached the center of the room, where the other noblewomen still stood, frozen in their places, the Duke stopped. His hand dropped from hers for the briefest moment, but the absence of his touch felt like a heavy void in the space between them. Eleanor swallowed hard, her throat dry. But before she could speak, the Duke turned to face the crowd. His voice rang out clear, commanding. "This is Eleanor Bradford," he announced, his gaze sweeping over the room. "The woman I choose." The words hung in the air, carrying a weight that sent a ripple of shock through the aristocrats gathered. Eleanor could feel the eyes on her, and though her body wanted to shrink under their gaze, she stood tall, her back straight, her chin lifted just enough to hide the tremble in her hands. Duke Sebastian didn't wait for applause or acknowledgement. He simply stood there, his presence alone filling the space. His hand returned to her side, this time with more assurance, as though the power he wielded was his alone to give. But for Eleanor, it felt as though the power had shifted. The choice had been made, but the consequences were yet to unfold. The murmurs of disbelief continued, but she no longer felt the sting of their judgment. The Duke had seen something in her, something no one else had, and that was enough to silence the world around her. As the crowd parted, the Duke led her to a quieter corner of the ballroom, away from the prying eyes, away from the whispers. The tension that had gripped Eleanor's chest loosened, but it was replaced by something else, something deeper, something unspoken. She stood before him, alone in this new world, where nothing was as it seemed. "You're not like the others," Sebastian said, his voice softer now, though still carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Eleanor looked up at him, searching his face for any trace of the man who had been so cold moments before. But there was nothing. He was unreadable. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The Duke's lips curled into a small, unreadable smile. "It means," he said, taking a step closer, "that you're the one I choose to shape this future with." The air between them thickened once more, heavy with the weight of his words. Eleanor didn't know if she was ready for this future, this sudden shift in her life. But there was no turning back now. She had been chosen, and the Duke, the most powerful man in the room, held the strings of her fate in his hands. The music played softly in the background, but for Eleanor, it was nothing more than a distant hum. The weight of the Duke's gaze on her felt like a tangible force, drawing her closer with every passing second. She could feel the pulse of the crowd around them, but it all seemed so far away. The ballroom, with its gilded mirrors and shining chandeliers, suddenly felt smaller, as if the space was closing in around her. Duke Sebastian stood next to her, his presence commanding, and yet he said nothing. His silence was louder than any words. She could hear the whispers of the guests, the uncertainty in their voices, but they were no longer for her. Her thoughts raced, but she could not break the trance that held her. His hand brushed against hers, his fingers brushing the edge of her sleeve. It was the slightest touch, but it felt like fire. Her heart skipped a beat. Every part of her wanted to flee, to retreat back to the shadows where she had always belonged. But the Duke held her there, not with words, but with his presence, his undeniable authority. Eleanor's breath quickened as he turned his attention to her. He was so close now that she could feel the heat radiating from him, the quiet power that seemed to emanate from his very being. For a moment, everything else faded into the background. There was no crowd, no whispers, no judgments, just the Duke and her. "Do you know why I chose you?" His voice was low, steady, a contrast to the whirlwind inside her. She shook her head, not trusting herself to speak. His gaze softened for the briefest moment, but the intensity never wavered. "You are the one who does not beg for attention," he said, his words carrying a weight she hadn't expected. "You do not try to be seen. That is what sets you apart from the rest." His eyes held hers, locking her in place, and for the first time, Eleanor felt like she was no longer invisible. The crowd around them seemed to shrink even further as the Duke stepped closer, his presence all-encompassing. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and electric. His hand moved, brushing her arm again, but this time it lingered, a possessive touch that sent a shiver down her spine. "You may not understand this now," he continued, his voice a quiet command, "but you will." His words were not a question, but a statement of undeniable truth. The crowd continued to watch, their curiosity palpable, but they remained distant, as if the space between them and the Duke had grown. Eleanor was caught between the man who had just chosen her and the weight of the world that had never seen her worth. "Do you trust me?" The question hung in the air, and though Eleanor could hear the uncertainty in her own heart, she knew there was no turning back. Her body responded before her mind could catch up. She nodded, her throat too tight to say anything more. The Duke's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Good," he murmured. With that, he turned, his hand still guiding her, leading her across the ballroom as though he owned every inch of it. The crowd parted silently, as if they understood that the Duke was no longer a part of their world, but the center of Eleanor's. Every step she took felt like a surrender, yet she didn't resist. She couldn't. His presence enveloped her, a constant reminder that she no longer belonged to the shadows. The tension between them grew with each step, each movement he made pulling her further into his orbit. Her heart raced, her hands clammy, but she did not pull away. The Duke had chosen her, and there was nothing she could do to change it. As they moved through the ballroom, the air seemed to grow heavier, the weight of their power dynamic becoming more pronounced. The noble women, once her equals, now felt like distant strangers, their eyes following her every move. Eleanor's mind was a whirlwind of emotions, fear, excitement, confusion, but above all, there was a strange, undeniable sense of belonging. She was no longer invisible. She was the Duke's choice, and for the first time in her life, that was enough. They stopped in the center of the room, and the Duke turned to face her, his gaze unwavering. She felt small in his presence, yet empowered in a way she had never known. The world seemed to pause around them, the music dimming in her ears as his hand reached out, guiding her once more. She had no choice but to follow. But this time, there was no hesitation. The Duke had chosen her, and now she would walk with him into a future unknown. The Duke's hand never left her side as they moved through the ballroom, his presence now a constant pull, drawing Eleanor deeper into the heart of the high society she had once only observed from the shadows. The murmur of whispers followed them, like a soft tide lapping at the edges of a storm. Eleanor could feel the eyes of the nobility boring into her, the weight of their judgment pressing down on her, but she did not look away. She couldn't. Not now. Not when the Duke's grip was the only thing anchoring her to this new reality. They stopped, and for the briefest moment, the world seemed to freeze. The music, the laughter, the rustling of silks, all of it stilled as the Duke turned to face her, his gaze unwavering. He did not smile, but there was something in his eyes, something that made Eleanor's heart skip a beat. He was not just the Duke now. He was the force that had chosen her, that had placed her in this moment of power. The crowd parted, and Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat. There was no turning back. She was no longer invisible. She was the Duke's, and everyone knew it. "Do not look away." The Duke's voice was low, just loud enough for her to hear, yet sharp enough to cut through the noise of the room. His words were not a command, yet they felt like one. Eleanor stood still, her hands clasped in front of her, but her pulse raced. The moment stretched, and she realized just how small she felt compared to the Duke, compared to the world he controlled. The room seemed to lean in, watching them, waiting for her to react, for her to fall apart under the weight of the eyes on her. But she didn't. Instead, she stood taller, her chin lifting just slightly, as though his choice had begun to transform her. "You'll learn what it means to be seen," the Duke said, almost to himself. His gaze flicked to the noble women around them, who had once looked at her with disdain. They were now reduced to silent onlookers, their power diminishing as the Duke's presence grew. Eleanor could feel the shift in the air, the change in the atmosphere. She was no longer the object of their scorn. She was the one who had been chosen. The Duke's eyes returned to hers, and for the first time, she saw something other than cold calculation in them. There was a flicker of something deeper, something almost unreadable, but it was there, just beneath the surface. The tension between them was palpable, thickening with each passing second. The room had become a stage, and they were the performers. No one else existed in this space. "I did not choose you by accident," the Duke continued, his voice steady, but there was an intensity to it that made Eleanor's stomach tighten. "You will be a reflection of me, and I will make sure you understand what that means." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Eleanor didn't know how to respond, and part of her didn't want to. The Duke was right. Her life had already changed in ways she couldn't understand. She was no longer the ignored noblewoman. She was now the one the Duke had claimed. But what did that mean for her? As if sensing her uncertainty, the Duke took a step closer, his presence so overwhelming that the air around them seemed to crackle. He lifted her chin, just a fraction of an inch, with a single finger, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Do not question this," he said, his voice low, his breath brushing against her skin. "I do not give second chances." The room held its breath, as if they too were waiting for her to break, to falter under the pressure. But Eleanor didn't. She couldn't. For the first time in her life, she felt something stir inside her, a fire she didn't know she had. The Duke's hand dropped from her chin, but the spark of that touch lingered. He turned, his back to her for a moment, and in that moment, the room seemed to shift. The aristocrats who had once looked down on her now saw her differently. They could no longer ignore her. The Duke had chosen her, and in doing so, he had given her something no one else could take away. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was the one who had been picked, the one who would be molded into something more, something greater than she had ever imagined. The music swelled once more, but Eleanor didn't hear it. All she could hear was the thumping of her own heart, the pulse of power running through her veins. The world had shifted, and she was no longer at its mercy. She was a part of it, a force to be reckoned with. And in that moment, Eleanor knew that nothing could ever be the same. The Duke's choice had set everything in motion, and nothing, not the nobles, not the whispers, not even her own fears, could stop it. The air in the ballroom was thick with tension, every movement, every breath hanging in the balance as Eleanor stood beside the Duke. The power dynamic had shifted again, and this time, it was more pronounced, sharper. She could feel the weight of the eyes upon her, the aristocrats whispering, their gazes sharp and critical, assessing her every move. But it was not their judgment that made her nervous, it was the Duke. His presence was overwhelming, and the way he looked at her now was different. There was an intensity in his gaze, a hunger she hadn't seen before. She had been chosen, yes, but the question lingered in her mind. Why? She could feel the pull of his authority as he guided her through the crowded ballroom, his hand firmly at the small of her back. His fingers, warm and steady, seemed to ignite a fire inside her. But there was no time to dwell on the heat that spread through her body. The Duke's grip was unyielding, and the closer they moved to the center of the room, the more the tension in the air grew. The aristocracy parted before them, but there was no reverence in their eyes, only scrutiny. And yet, Eleanor couldn't help but feel as though she were walking through a dream in which the rules had changed, and she was no longer an invisible figure in the background. The music played on, but it felt distant, like a faint echo. The crowd's whispers seemed muffled, as though they were underwater. It was just her and the Duke now. And as they reached the center of the ballroom, everything stopped. The movement of the dancers, the soft hum of the crowd, it all ceased in an instant. Freeze motion. The world held its breath. Duke Sebastian stopped walking, his hand still on her back, and turned to face her. The room seemed to contract around them, shrinking until it was just the two of them in that space, alone. Do you understand now? The Duke's voice was low, deliberate, his words cutting through the stillness. Eleanor's heart raced, her chest tightening with the weight of his question. She tried to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she nodded, though she wasn't sure she fully understood. He didn't wait for her to answer. He didn't need to. The Duke's eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. He was a man who commanded attention, who controlled everything and everyone in his orbit. And now, she was a part of that orbit, whether she was ready or not. "You're not like the others," he said, his voice sharp, almost cutting. Eleanor felt a shiver run down her spine at his words. She wasn't sure what he meant by that, what made her different, but she knew he saw something in her, something that no one else had. The Duke stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. Eleanor felt the space between them shrink until there was barely any room left. She could feel his breath, the warmth of his body as it radiated toward her. She didn't step back. She couldn't. The Duke's hand brushed against her arm, his touch gentle but firm, as if reminding her of the power he wielded. "You will learn," he murmured, his voice low, filled with a promise that made her stomach tighten. Eleanor swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond. There was no escape now, no way to go back to the life she had known. She was here, in this moment, with the Duke, and whatever came next was beyond her control. The music began. Again, but it was distant now, as though the world had shifted and she was no longer a part of it. All she could hear was the beat of her own heart, the pulse of something new, something dangerous. The Duke was right. She was not like the others. But what did that mean? What did it mean for her future, for her place in this world he controlled? The crowd was still watching, still waiting for something, but Eleanor could not focus on them. She couldn't even focus on the whispers that began to swell around her. She could only focus on the Duke, his presence, the power in his every word and every glance. And as he turned to address the room once more, his hand still at her back, Eleanor felt a shift inside her. She was no longer the woman who had been invisible, who had stood in the shadows, hoping for a moment of recognition. She was the woman the Duke had chosen. And whatever came next, whatever power this choice held, she would have to face it. The room around them swirled with activity, but Eleanor remained still, the Duke's hand guiding her every step. He was in control, and now, so was she. But as she walked with him through the ballroom, her mind raced, her heart pounded, and she couldn't help but wonder what the future would hold for her. She had been chosen, but at what cost? The Duke's presence was as commanding as ever, but now, as they moved through the ballroom, Eleanor could feel a shift. The whispers that had once followed her now surrounded them both, thicker, louder, as though the air itself had thickened. Every eye was upon her, and the weight of the room's scrutiny pressed down on her chest, tightening with each step she took. Her heart raced, but she forced herself to remain composed, the Duke's hand a constant, reassuring pressure at her back. She could feel the strength in his touch, the control that he exerted over her, over everything in the room. The power dynamic between them had shifted completely. No longer was she the invisible woman, standing in the shadows. She was the one who had been chosen, and with that choice came a weight she had never expected. But as she glanced at the guests around her, she realized that the weight was not just hers to bear. It was theirs as well. The aristocracy that had once scorned her now watched her every move, measuring her every gesture, every step. Eleanor felt like an exhibit in a grand show, her every motion scrutinized, dissected. She could feel the tension between them and the Duke, the unspoken questions in their eyes. They were waiting for her to falter, to break under the pressure. But she didn't. She couldn't. The Duke's hand moved slightly, just enough to guide her into the center of the room. The music had faded into the background, the murmurs of the crowd more distinct now, sharper, as though the very air around them had frozen. It was in this suspended moment that Eleanor felt the power shift once again. She was no longer a passive participant in this game. She was part of it, entwined in the Duke's world. His world was full of power, manipulation, and strategy. She had been chosen, yes, but she had no illusions about what that choice meant. The Duke's power was all-encompassing, and she would have to learn how to navigate it, how to survive it. She felt his gaze on her now, unwavering, his eyes filled with an unreadable intensity. She wanted to speak, to ask him what all of this meant, but she couldn't find the words. Every time she tried to open her mouth, her throat tightened. She could feel the weight of his attention on her, suffocating in its intensity. But then, as if sensing her unease, the Duke spoke, his voice low, his words carrying the weight of a command. "Do not look away," he said. His words were not harsh, but there was an unmistakable power in them, a command that made the room fall silent once again. Eleanor didn't dare look away. She couldn't. She could feel the shift inside her, the way his words wrapped around her like chains. For a moment, the world outside them disappeared. There was only the Duke, and there was only her. The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension building, the crowd waiting for her to do something, anything, that would break the spell. But Eleanor stood still, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with questions she didn't know how to ask. The Duke's grip tightened on her arm, not painfully, but firmly, reminding her of her place beside him. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, but they didn't matter. Not anymore. All that mattered was him. The Duke, the man who had chosen her. His gaze never left hers, and for the first time, Eleanor wondered if she was more than just a pawn in his game. But she couldn't find the answer. Not yet. The Duke's next words were soft, but they struck her like a blow. "They will test you," he said, his voice low, barely audible above the murmurs of the crowd. "But you must never show them weakness." His hand left her arm, and for a split second, she felt the absence of his touch like a physical ache. But before she could react, he took a step back, allowing her to feel the full weight of the crowd's gaze upon her. It was as if she had been released from the tension, but it was replaced by something much heavier. A new kind of pressure. The pressure of expectation. The pressure of power. Eleanor knew then that the real challenge had only just begun. The Duke had chosen her, but that choice was not a gift. It was a challenge, and she would have to rise to meet it. The room around them seemed to swell, the whispers growing louder as the tension reached its peak. Eleanor could feel her heart racing in her chest, the fear creeping up her spine, but she stood her ground. The Duke had not chosen her to fail. He had chosen her because he saw something in her that no one else had. The question was, what did she see in herself? The answer would come later. But for now, as the Duke turned away, leading her deeper into the ballroom, Eleanor knew that she was no longer just a woman caught in a world of power and privilege. She was a player in it, and her move would be the next one. The ballroom was a sea of opulence, but to Eleanor, it had become a cage. The Duke's presence at her side was an anchor, yet each step they took forward only seemed to weigh her down more. The murmurs of the guests grew louder, more pronounced, each whisper a sharp reminder of her place in this world. She could feel their eyes on her, sharp and calculating, but it was the Duke's gaze that held the most power. He never looked away, never showed a flicker of doubt. His grip on her arm was firm, unyielding, guiding her through the maze of aristocrats. But as they moved through the crowd, the tension between them thickened, building with every passing second. Eleanor's heart raced, but she fought to keep her composure. She wasn't the same woman who had entered this ballroom just hours ago. No, she was something different now, something changed. But the question lingered, was it for the better? The Duke led her to the center of the room, where the other noblewomen stood, their faces a mixture of disbelief and disdain. They could not understand what had just occurred. They could not fathom why the Duke, who had rejected so many, had chosen her. And yet, the power he held, the control he exerted, was undeniable. His very presence shifted the dynamics of the room, pushing everything around them into sharp focus. The crowd parted in silence, their eyes following every move they made. Eleanor's body was stiff with the weight of it all, but the Duke never faltered, never lost his confidence. As they reached the center, the Duke's hand left her arm for a brief moment, but the absence of his touch sent a shiver down her spine. It was then that Eleanor realized This was not just about her. This was about power. The Duke's power. The power he had over everyone in this room, including her. He turned to face the crowd, his posture straight, his gaze unwavering. "I've made my choice," he declared, his voice carrying across the ballroom like a wave crashing on the shore. "This is Eleanor Bradford, the one I have chosen." The words hung in the air, heavy with significance. The aristocrats looked at her, their eyes wide with disbelief, but it was the Duke's steady gaze that commanded their attention. No one dared question him. Eleanor felt their stares, but she no longer cared. She had been chosen, and that fact was undeniable. The power had shifted. She was no longer an outsider. She was a part of this world now. And as the Duke spoke, she could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, not with disdain, but with curiosity. They were all watching, waiting to see what would happen next. She had no idea what the future held, but she knew one thing: there was no turning back. The Duke turned back to her, his hand moving to rest at the small of her back once again, guiding her through the crowd. His touch was a silent command, one that she couldn't ignore, even if she tried. "You will learn," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, but still carrying the weight of a man used to being obeyed. Eleanor's stomach tightened at his words, but there was something else there too, a spark of defiance. She was not just a pawn in his game. She was more than that. She would have to be. She couldn't survive this world by simply being the Duke's choice. She had to carve out a place for herself, a place where she could stand on her own. The Duke's gaze softened ever so slightly, but his grip on her back never wavered. He was leading her, guiding her through this world, but there was no doubt in her mind that he was also testing her. And that test would not be easy. The power dynamic between them was clear. He was in control, and she was his choice. But Eleanor wasn't sure if she was ready to be controlled. She wasn't sure if she could be. The ballroom continued to swirl around them, the music rising once more, but the tension remained. Eleanor could feel it in her bones, could see it in the eyes of the nobles around her. The moment had shifted. The world had changed, and she was no longer just a spectator. She was part of the game. The question now was, could she play it? The Duke turned toward her, his eyes searching hers for something, but she didn't know what. She didn't know what he expected from her, but she knew she couldn't let him see her falter. Not now. Not when the eyes of the world were watching. He spoke again, his voice commanding, but this time, there was something more in it, something softer, almost like a promise. "You will learn what it means to be seen, Eleanor," he said, his words dripping with meaning. She nodded, her throat tight, her heart pounding. She didn't know what that meant. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing: she would have to be strong. The Duke had chosen her, and now, she had to prove she was worthy of that choice. The room was alive with the hum of conversation, but for Eleanor, it felt suffocating, the air thick with the tension between them. The Duke's presence beside her was undeniable, like an anchor keeping her tethered to a reality she could not escape. His hand, steady and firm at the small of her back, guided her forward, but each step she took felt like a deeper descent into his world. She could feel the weight of every gaze on her, the nobility around them observing, waiting for a sign, for something to shift. But nothing was shifting. Not yet. The crowd parted as they made their way through the ballroom, their whispers trailing behind them like a dark cloud. Eleanor could hear them. Soft murmurs, glances exchanged, judgments passed. Who is she? What does he see in her? She kept her eyes forward, but the questions burned through her. What did he see in her? She had no title, no wealth to offer, nothing but her name and the choice the Duke had made. Yet here she was, walking at his side like she was a part of this world. His world. The Duke's eyes flicked toward her briefly, and in that fleeting moment, Eleanor felt it. The change, the shift in the air. The pressure was building between them, intensifying with every step they took. They reached the center of the ballroom, the crowd now surrounding them, a sea of faces, all watching. The music swelled, but it was distant, muffled by the suffocating tension that wrapped itself around Eleanor's chest. She felt his fingers brush against her arm, sending a jolt through her. It was a small touch, but it was enough to send a wave of heat crashing through her. "Stand tall," he whispered, his voice low, yet filled with a quiet command. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat, her body instinctively straightening. His words were not a suggestion, they were an order, and she obeyed without question. The power dynamic between them was undeniable. He was the Duke, the man who controlled everything in this room, everything in her life now. And she was his, chosen, but still uncertain of what came next. The crowd watched, their eyes flicking between the Duke and Eleanor, waiting for her to falter, for some sign of weakness. But there was no weakness. Not now. The Duke's hand moved to her shoulder, his touch steady, unwavering. "You will learn what it means to be in control," he said, his voice colder now, harder, as though he were speaking not to her, but to the room. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The tension between them was palpable, and yet, she could not look away. She was drawn to him, to the power he exuded, to the quiet control he wielded over her and the room. "Do not disappoint me," he added, his words hanging in the air like a challenge, a test. Eleanor's chest tightened. She felt the weight of the expectation in his voice, the pressure of it suffocating her. She had been chosen, yes, but she was not naive. This was no favor, no kindness. This was about power, and the Duke had all of it. She stood there, rooted to the spot, as the room swirled around them, as the tension continued to rise. The music, the conversations, the soft clinks of glasses, they all felt like distant echoes now. All that mattered was the Duke, and his eyes that never left her. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing with the weight of his words. The pressure of the room, the weight of the expectations placed upon her, was suffocating. She could feel herself slipping, but she could not falter. She would not. The Duke's hand tightened on her shoulder, a silent reminder that she was under his watch. His grip was not harsh, but it was firm, steady, like a tether that would not allow her to drift away. His presence filled the room, and Eleanor realized that she was no longer just a bystander in this world. She was a part of it now, a part of him. And with that realization came the weight of everything he expected from her. "I chose you," the Duke said, his voice low, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "You will stand beside me. You will show them all that you belong here." His words were final, a statement, not a question. And in that moment, Eleanor understood. She had no choice. This was her life now. This was her place. The Duke had chosen her, and with that choice came the burden of his expectations, the weight of the power he held, the power that would now shape her. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, but she stood tall, her back straight, her chin lifted just enough to hide the tremble in her hands. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer the forgotten woman in the corner. She was the Duke's, and that meant something. But what exactly, she could not yet tell. The tension between them had reached its peak, the air thick with the weight of what had just been said. The music played on, but Eleanor barely heard it. The world around her had gone quiet, the only sound that of her own heart, pounding in her chest. She had been chosen. But what did that mean for her future? The answer was still unclear, hidden behind the Duke's commanding presence, his unreadable gaze. But she would find out. She had to. And as they stood there, in the center of the ballroom, the power shift was undeniable. Eleanor was no longer the woman they had once dismissed. She was the woman the Duke had chosen. And that choice was her only reality now. The ballroom was charged with an energy unlike any Eleanor had ever felt before. The Duke's hand remained firmly at her back, but it was no longer a comforting presence. It was a tether, pulling her along a path she could not escape. The whispers of the aristocrats around them had grown louder, more insistent. She could feel the weight of their gaze, their judgment, but it was not their thoughts that unsettled her now. It was the Duke. The tension between them had escalated to a point she could barely contain. As they moved through the room, the air around them thickened, pressing in on her chest. Every step felt like a test, a challenge, not just from the Duke, but from the world he had pulled her into. His presence was overwhelming, but there was something else beneath it. Eleanor could feel it now, the shift in the power dynamic. She was no longer just his choice. She was something else, something he was trying to shape, trying to mold. But the question burned in her mind. What did he expect from her? What had she become in his eyes? The crowd parted as they moved toward the center of the room, but Eleanor didn't notice them. She didn't notice anything except the Duke. His eyes were focused, sharp, like a predator honing in on its prey. His grip tightened just slightly on her back, and the pressure sent a shiver through her. "You must learn to carry yourself differently." The Duke's voice was low, almost a growl, but it carried a command in it that she couldn't ignore. You are not like the others. You will never be like the others. His words sliced through her, and Eleanor felt a pang deep in her chest. She wasn't sure if he meant it as a compliment or a condemnation, but it didn't matter. She could feel the truth of it, the reality that had been laid bare. She was different now. She wasn't the woman she had been when she first entered this room. She wasn't even the woman she had been hours ago. The Duke's grip on her shifted, pulling her closer, forcing her to face him. His eyes locked onto hers, cold, calculating. For the first time since he had chosen her, Eleanor saw something in his gaze that unsettled her. A glimmer of something deeper, something far more dangerous than she had anticipated. The crowd around them was still, their eyes not leaving the pair of them, but Eleanor couldn't focus on them anymore. Her attention was consumed by the Duke, by the pressure of his presence, by the weight of his power. He leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "You are mine," he whispered, his words so quiet that only she could hear. The words hit her like a thunderclap, sending a jolt of energy through her. She stood still, her breath catching in her throat. What did he mean by that? She was his, but what did that really mean? Was it ownership? Was it control? Or was it something deeper, something darker than she could fully comprehend? The moment stretched, the tension between them unbearable. She could feel her heart hammering in her chest, her body betraying her, reacting to the closeness of him, to the power in his touch. And then, before she could gather her thoughts, the Duke pulled away, his hand slipping from her back. The air between them seemed to crackle with the electricity of unspoken words. He turned, but not without giving her one last look, one that pierced her to the core. "Follow me," he said, his voice not a request but an order. And without thinking, without questioning, Eleanor followed. She had no choice. He was the Duke. He had chosen her. And now, she was his. The ballroom swirled around them, but Eleanor barely registered it. She was too focused on the Duke, on the tension in the air, on the weight of the moment that was quickly building to a crescendo. The power between them had shifted, and she was caught in its pull. As they moved through the room, the aristocrats watched, their eyes fixed on the pair of them. Some were curious, others confused, but all of them were waiting to see what would happen next. And Eleanor could feel it. The power in the air, the heavy expectation that hung over her. She was no longer the woman they had all looked down upon. She was the woman the Duke had chosen, the woman they would all watch. But she was more than just a pawn in the Duke's game. She would prove it. She would show them all. The Duke led her to a quieter corner of the ballroom, the crowd thinning as they passed. His hand returned to her back, a gentle pressure guiding her forward. The tension between them was almost unbearable, but Eleanor could feel something else now, something fierce, something rising within her. The power that had once felt suffocating was now something she was beginning to understand. She was no longer just his choice. She was becoming a force of her own. And as they stopped in the corner, the Duke turned to face her once more. His gaze was steady, but there was something in his eyes now, something almost approving. "You are not like the others," he said again, his voice softer now, but still carrying the weight of his command. Eleanor held his gaze, her own eyes burning with the realization that she was more than she had ever been. The Duke had chosen her, but she had not been molded by him. She was forging her own path, and the tension between them was not a sign of weakness. It was a spark, one that would ignite something far greater than either of them had imagined. The ballroom felt smaller with each passing moment. The eyes of the guests were no longer just watching. They were waiting, anticipating the next move in the game the Duke and Eleanor were playing. The air was thick with tension, the power dynamics shifting once again, but this time, it was different. This time, Eleanor felt it more than ever before. The subtle pull in her chest, the need to break free from the invisible chains the Duke had forged around her. His hand, firm on her back, urged her forward, but she could feel his presence in ways she never had before. The room had become a stage, and they were its only players. The orchestra continued to play, but its sound was distant, muted by the pounding of Eleanor's own heart. The Duke's eyes were steady, unwavering, as he guided her through the crowd. She had never felt so aware of herself, of him, and of the weight of the moment. She was no longer the woman who had stood in the corner, unnoticed and invisible. She was now the woman at the center of the storm, the one everyone watched, the one everyone whispered about. And the Duke, he was the storm. His presence was both a promise and a threat, a force she couldn't deny, no matter how hard she tried. As they moved through the ballroom, Eleanor's mind raced. She had no illusions anymore. She knew what the Duke wanted from her: control, obedience, submission. But what did she want? The question haunted her, but she pushed it aside. She couldn't afford to think about it now. She couldn't afford to question anything. Not when the Duke's hand was still at her back, guiding her forward. Not when his gaze was still fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel both small and powerful at once. They stopped at the center of the room again, and Eleanor could feel the eyes of the crowd on them, the weight of their judgment heavier than ever. But this time, it wasn't just the Duke who held power. It was her, too. She had been chosen, yes, but she was no longer just a passive participant in this dance. She had learned the rules, and now she was ready to play. The Duke turned to face her, his eyes searching hers as if trying to read the thoughts swirling in her mind. The tension between them was palpable, thick enough to suffocate, but Eleanor refused to break. She refused to look away. "You've come far," the Duke said, his voice low, almost as though he were speaking to himself. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "But the real challenge begins now." His words hit her like a thunderclap, the gravity of their meaning sinking in with the force of a storm. The real challenge? What did he mean? Eleanor's mind spun, but before she could gather her thoughts, the Duke took a step closer to her, closing the space between them. His hand reached out, and for a moment, the room seemed to freeze. The music stopped. The whispers fell silent. It was just her and him, the weight of his power pressing down on her like a suffocating force. He took her chin in his hand, tilting her face upward so that she was forced to meet his gaze. The world around them faded. There was only the Duke, and in that moment, Eleanor realized something she hadn't seen before. This wasn't just about submission. It was about choice. His choice. Her choice. The balance of power was not as one-sided as it had seemed. She had a part to play in this, whether she wanted to or not. She could feel the shift in the air, the sudden tension, the undeniable charge between them. The Duke's grip on her chin tightened, but it wasn't painful. It was commanding, possessive, and as his eyes bored into hers, Eleanor could feel something inside her snap. A switch had been flipped, and the power had shifted. "You will do as I say," he whispered, his voice low, but with an edge of something darker, something more dangerous. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't pull away. She didn't resist. She couldn't. His touch, his gaze, it held her in place, like a moth caught in a flame. "And you will learn," he continued, his words sharp and clear, "what it truly means to be mine." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Eleanor couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She was drowning in the weight of it all. And yet, there was a part of her, a small, rebellious part, that wanted to fight. She wasn't just a pawn. She wasn't just an object to be claimed. She was a woman, and she would find her own way. The Duke's fingers slid from her chin to the back of her neck, pulling her closer, his breath warm against her skin. The moment stretched, and in the stillness of the ballroom, Eleanor realized the truth. This was no longer just about her place in society. This was about her place beside the Duke, in this world of power and manipulation. And whatever came next, whatever the Duke expected of her, she would have to face it. There was no escape. There was only him. The room seemed to close in on them as the Duke released her neck, but the connection between them remained. The power shift was complete. The tension in the air was unbearable, but it wasn't just his power that held her now. It was something else. Something deep inside her had been awakened. She was no longer the woman who had entered the ballroom, unsure of her place. She was someone different now, someone who understood the stakes of this game. The Duke had chosen her, and she had chosen to play. The crowd, once again, fell silent, their eyes fixed on the pair of them. Eleanor stood tall, her back straight, her chin lifted just enough to show the world that she was no longer the woman they had dismissed. The Duke's choice had given her power, and now she would wield it. The ballroom was alive with muted whispers, but Eleanor could barely hear them. She felt the world narrowing, the sounds and sights around her blurring into nothingness. There was only one thing in focus: the Duke. His presence dominated everything, his hand still at her back, his grip firmer now, like a silent command. His eyes, dark and intense, never left her. The weight of his gaze was suffocating, and yet, she couldn't look away. The tension between them had reached its peak, building and coiling like a storm about to break. The guests had fallen silent, their eyes fixed on the pair of them, but Eleanor felt like she and the Duke were the only two people in the room. The weight of the power shift that had occurred was undeniable. She was no longer just the woman he had chosen. She was more than that. She had been molded by his touch, his control, his gaze. And she could feel herself changing, her identity slipping away as she became part of his world. But just as she thought she might understand the nature of this power, something shifted again. The room seemed to freeze. The Duke's expression hardened, and for the briefest moment, Eleanor thought she saw a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. It was then that the truth began to reveal itself, like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. The realization hit her like a wave, knocking the breath out of her. She had been played. She had been part of a game, one where she had been blind to the rules. The Duke had not just chosen her, he had manipulated her. His choice had been more calculated, more deliberate than she had ever known. Her role was never about being valued. It was about something else entirely. The power he wielded was not just his own. It was a reflection of what he could control. And she had been the tool he used to maintain that control. The realization stunned her, but the truth didn't sink in slowly. It slammed into her all at once, overwhelming her. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. She had been living in a lie, and now the veil had been lifted. She had been seen, but not for the reasons she thought. The Duke hadn't chosen her because of her worth. He had chosen her because he could bend her to his will. And that realization struck deeper than anything he had ever said. The world around her spun, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. The crowd was still silent, waiting for the next move, but Eleanor couldn't move. She stood frozen, caught between the man who had chosen her and the woman she had once been, the woman who had hoped for something more, something real. The Duke's hand slid from her back to her arm, his grip strong and unwavering. She felt the pressure of it, the possessiveness, and it made her want to recoil. But she didn't. She couldn't. "You were never meant to be free," he said, his voice cold, void of the warmth it once held. His words were sharp, each one cutting deeper than the last. "You are a part of this world, Eleanor, whether you like it or not." The room seemed to, close and around them, the weight of his words hanging in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Eleanor's heart raced in her chest, her breath shallow. His words were like ice, freezing her in place. "You're wrong," she whispered, the words slipping from her lips before she could stop them. The Duke's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, she saw something flicker behind the coldness in his gaze, a flash of something dangerous. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, and the world seemed to hold its breath. "Am I?" he asked, his voice low, challenging. The tension in the air was unbearable, the silence between them deafening. Eleanor's hands trembled, but she refused to show weakness. She couldn't. Not now. Not when she finally understood the game he had been playing. The Duke's gaze softened, but only for a moment. "You belong to me," he said, his voice quiet. But there was an undeniable power behind the words. "You always have." His words should have terrified her. And yet, they didn't. Instead, she felt a spark of defiance deep within her. The power he held over her was immense, but she had a choice, too. She wasn't his possession, not anymore. The truth had been laid bare, and now, she had the strength to face it. Her heart hammered in her chest as the realization settled in. She could either remain his pawn or take control of her own destiny. And for the first time, Eleanor knew what she had to do. She couldn't let him keep her in this cage. She couldn't let him control her anymore. She straightened, her posture shifting, her gaze unwavering as she looked into the Duke's eyes. She could feel the tension between them. The power that had once been his now beginning to shift in her favor. The crowd, still watching, sensed the change, their whispers growing louder, but Eleanor didn't care. The Duke had underestimated her. She wasn't the woman he thought she was. She was more. She was stronger, and she would prove it. The Duke stepped back, his eyes narrowing as if he could sense the shift in her. The world around them seemed to shift with it, the room suddenly feeling smaller, the walls closing in. But Eleanor stood her ground. The power between them had changed, and she would no longer be his to control. "You think you own me," she said, her voice steady, her words sharp, and clear. But I'm not yours to claim. The Duke's gaze faltered, just for a second, but it was enough. The tension in the room had reached its breaking point. Eleanor was no longer the woman she had once been. She was no longer his, and she would not let him forget it. The ballroom was silent, the heavy weight of the Duke's gaze pressing down on Eleanor like a storm about to break. Her chest tightened as the tension in the air escalated, the sharpness of their unspoken words cutting through the room. The guests around them were frozen, their eyes wide with anticipation, their whispers hanging in the air like distant echoes. But Eleanor didn't care about them anymore. She didn't care about the opinions of the nobility or their judgments. All that mattered was the Duke and the power that had shifted between them. He had chosen her, but that choice had come at a cost she was beginning to understand. The moment before the storm, before the final unraveling, was almost unbearable. The Duke's hand had once again settled on her back, but this time, there was no comfort in it. It was a firm command, a reminder that he still held the reins, still controlled the space between them. Eleanor could feel the weight of it. Every nerve in her body screamed to break free, to reclaim the control she had lost. But as his fingers pressed against her spine, a strange sense of calm washed over her. She was no longer just his choice. She was no longer just a part of his world. She was carving her own path, even if it was in the shadows of his presence. You think you can walk away from this? The Duke's voice was low, a quiet challenge that echoed in the silence between them. Eleanor's heart raced, her breath shallow. The tension was so thick, it felt like the very air had frozen around them. The crowd stood motionless, waiting for her to respond, to make the next move. But the power between them was shifting again, this time in a way she hadn't expected. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze. The room seemed to stretch around them, every movement around them distorted by the gravity of the moment. She could feel his eyes on her, waiting for her to break. But Eleanor didn't. She wouldn't. She had learned what it meant to stand tall, to show strength in the face of control. She had learned that she could be both his and her own. She could feel it in her bones now, the deep, powerful shift in her own confidence. The Duke stepped closer, his presence engulfing her, but this time, Eleanor didn't shrink back. She stood her ground, her posture straight, her body braced for whatever came next. His hand moved, but it wasn't to guide her, it was to pull her closer. The world around them blurred, but the tension between them intensified. The moment before he touched her, before the power dynamics would shift again, was stretched to its breaking point. Time froze, and in the silence, Eleanor felt the truth. This was no longer just about submission. This was about control. And now, the control was in her hands as much as it was in his. The Duke's fingers grazed her arm, pulling her toward him, his strength undeniable. But Eleanor didn't flinch. She didn't falter. The crowd gasped, but Eleanor's eyes remained locked on his, unwavering. The Duke was in front of her now, his gaze fixed, intense, but there was something else in it, a flicker of something like respect. For the first time, she saw it in his eyes. She had done what no one had expected. She had risen to meet him, to meet the power he had tried to wield over her. You are not who I thought you were. The Duke's voice was soft, but his words carried the weight of 100 unspoken truths. The revelation hit her like a wave. She had broken free of the chains he had placed around her. She had reclaimed her power. And in that moment, the Duke realized it. The power he had held over her had shifted. The room was still, but Eleanor could feel the heat in the air, the charge between them that had transformed the power dynamics. She wasn't his pawn anymore. She wasn't just a choice. She was the one who had chosen to stand. She could feel the shift in the crowd, the way the tension melted away, replaced by awe. The Duke stepped back, his eyes never leaving hers. You have surprised me, Eleanor, he said, his voice low but filled with something almost approving. Eleanor's chest tightened, but she kept her composure. She had played his game, but she had played it on her terms. I am not yours to control, she said, her voice steady, firm. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their meaning. The Duke's expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes. He had expected her to fall, to submit. But she hadn't. She had become something more than he had ever anticipated. The power between them had shifted completely. Eleanor was no longer a passive participant in this world. She had claimed her own place beside him, and in doing so, had turned the very rules of their relationship upside down. The room remained silent, the finality of the moment settling over them like a heavy blanket. The Duke's gaze softened, but only slightly. There was no longer any tension between them, just a deep, unspoken understanding. "Perhaps you will be a worthy ally after all," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor stood tall, her heart still racing, but with a sense of triumph she hadn't known she possessed. The Duke had underestimated her, and now she had shown him exactly who she was. The ballroom had been filled with power struggles, with manipulations and expectations, but in this moment, Eleanor had claimed her victory. She was no longer a pawn in the Duke's game. She was the player, and she would never be invisible again. The room was still, as though time itself had momentarily paused. The tension between Eleanor and the Duke hung in the air, thick and electric, and for the first time since they had entered the ballroom, Eleanor felt a deep, undeniable peace settle over her. The game had ended, but not in the way she had expected. The Duke stood before her, his expression unreadable, but there was something in the way he held himself that spoke louder than words. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably, and Eleanor knew that she was no longer the woman who had entered this world on the fringes. She had found her place, not by submitting to the Duke, but by standing beside him, by showing him a side of herself he had never anticipated. He had thought he could control her, bend her to his will, but it was she who had molded herself into something more, something powerful in her own right. The Duke's gaze softened, but only for a moment. His eyes, which had once been cold and calculating, now held a flicker of something almost like respect. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough. The words he had spoken earlier, the promises and the challenges, hung in the air between them, unfinished, unsaid. But the truth was clear. Eleanor had chosen her own path. She was no longer the pawn in his game. She was a player. The crowd, still silent and watchful, seemed to fade into the background, their whispers now just a distant hum. There was only the Duke, and there was only Eleanor. And for the first time, she felt that the weight of their shared world was no longer something to fear. It was something she could handle. The Duke reached out, his hand coming to rest lightly on her shoulder, a gesture that would have once felt possessive, but now it felt like a simple acknowledgement, a silent recognition of the journey they had both taken. "You've surprised me," he said, his voice low, but there was no malice in it, only something unexpected. It was a statement, not a challenge. A statement that held a weight of its own, the meaning not lost on Eleanor. She didn't need his approval to know her worth. She didn't need anyone's approval. She had already proven herself. But hearing it from him, hearing him acknowledge her strength, was something she hadn't expected. She had come into this world unsure of who she was, uncertain of her place. But now, standing before the Duke, she realized she had always known. She had always been worthy. She just had to find it within herself. "You are no longer the invisible woman you once were," the Duke continued, his hand still resting on her shoulder. "You have stepped into your own." His words, though simple, carried a weight that spoke to everything they had both endured. The shift in their relationship was complete. The power had balanced, but it was no longer his to hold alone. Eleanor had found her voice, and now she was ready to claim it. The room, still buzzing with unspoken thoughts, began to feel less like a cage and more like a stage. Eleanor had played her part, and the final act was unfolding before her eyes. She turned slightly toward the Duke, her eyes steady and confident, and for a moment, there was a stillness between them, a moment of quiet understanding. The tension had not fully dissipated. There was still something unspoken between them, something unresolved. But Eleanor was no longer afraid of it. She was no longer afraid of him. The Duke's gaze softened, his fingers brushing against her arm, a touch that once would have signaled control, but now felt like something else, something more. He stepped back slightly, giving her space, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that told her the story was far from over. Eleanor nodded, the weight of his acknowledgement settling deep within her. She wasn't just his choice anymore. She had made her own choices, and she would continue to make them. The room began to stir, the murmur of voices growing louder, but for Eleanor, the world outside the Duke no longer mattered. She had stepped into the light, and she would not retreat back into the shadows. As the Duke turned away, his hand sliding from her shoulder, Eleanor could feel the space between them. It was not one of distance, but one of mutual understanding. Their power had been realigned, and yet something new had formed between them, a respect, a shared recognition of what they could accomplish together. And as the room continued to hum with life, Eleanor stood tall, her head held high. The Duke had once controlled her world, but now she controlled her own. And in this moment, that was enough.